Okay, well, maybe I'll start with why did it take so long for Darwin to get to that point. And historians kind of argue about this. Some people said he was absolutely terrified and he didn't want to, he didn't want to have all of this anger poured down on his head. And I think that's largely wrong. Not entirely, but largely. I think that that Darwin recognized that he was playing with, that he was playing with fire. That if you're going to have a theory that explains the grand scope of biology, you really need to have it done solidly. And so that he spent the time to as he said in his, not just to give time for his imagination, but to test everything. And there's so many things to test, and so many things that he did test. So in the midst of this, he, actually I mentioned several times Joseph Hooker. So he's writing this letter to Joseph Hooker. Hooker is the first person he tells about his theory. Kind of jokes, it's like confessing a murder. And so Hooker is not convinced, and at one point Darwin, in this exchange, Darwin says, well, I need to test this better. And so what he does is, okay, I got this theory, but how does it correspond to what we actually see in the natural world? What classification of species? And so he spends 8 years classifying barnacles. Why? In fact, some people say, you got the greatest theory in the history of science. Why are you doing something as mundane as classifying barnacles? Because by classifying barnacles, he can convince himself either that he's right or he's wrong. And in fact, classifying barnacles convinced himself that he was right. So that's a huge chunk of time, spending those 8 years classifying sort of barnacles. In fact, it came to the point where his young children would go over to their friend's house and says, where does your father keep his barnacles? So the whole family was organized around Darwin's barnacles. He finishes the barnacle work, and he decides that he's going to write a 3-volume door stopper to explain all of his ideas. Like, we're talking probably 1,500 pages, an immense undertaking, and he's working on that when he gets this letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, a younger naturalist who was doing work at that time in modern day sort of Indonesia, who sets out a theory very similar to his own. He sends it to Darwin and says, if you think this is good, can you pass this on to a geologist named Charles Lyell to see what he thinks? And Darwin is like, oh my God, this is my theory. So he talks to Hooker, he talks to Lyell, what are you going to do? And the compromise is that both Wallace's theory and Darwin's theory is presented jointly at a major London meeting of the Linnaean Society. So what this does is this allows Darwin to keep his priority, but without kind of stepping on sort of Wallace. And at that point, this is 1858, Darwin recognizes that, well, I just can't let this go on a short paper. I don't have time to finish my big 3-volume book. Thank God, said Joseph Hooker, because he said it would choke every naturalist of the 19th century. And instead he writes this abstract, which runs almost 500 words. And so he never actually does write his big book. It gets subsumed by the order of species.
You touched on geology a little bit, but I'm wondering how much geology was known at that time, and how aware was Darwin of sort of our modern understanding of geology, continental drift, etc. And did that play at all to his writings?
Oh yeah, Darwin was deeply immersed in geology. In fact, if Darwin would have died, say, in, 1848, he would have been remembered as a geologist. In fact, when John Herschel, who I mentioned, was editing a book called The Admiralty Manual, basically to provide naval officers and others with information on how to do science, Darwin wrote the chapter on geology. So Darwin was deeply immersed in geology. He was very closely tied into the networks of the leading geologists. And geology was one of the great sciences of the first half of the 19th century. You see this revolution in the understanding of the Earth. The Earth is old. You understood the patterns of how you can see the strata being created. You see the geological maps. You saw the first explosion of kind of religious objections. I mean, because when Darwin comes back from the Beagle in the 1830s, there were a lot of people condemning geology for throwing out the chronology of Genesis. And so Darwin was part of the group that threw out the chronology of Genesis, as did the Reverend Adam Sedgwick, his mentor in Cambridge, or the Reverend William Buckland, and others. And so, yeah, the geology was incredibly sophisticated. Darwin knew it well.
Sure how much I read, or maybe I saw in a movie, so my facts might be this mixed up. But wasn't Darwin's father either very devout, or he was a man of the cloth himself, and he opposed Darwin going on that Beagle trip, and he also, I think that I've read that's why Darwin had some problems trying to publish, or that he wanted to publish, so he held back publishing.
Yeah, well, his father wasn't particularly devout. In fact, his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was kind of famously a freethinker in the 18th century. His father, like his grandfather, was a doctor, not a clergyman. His father would have been kind of concerned more about kind of religion in terms of its social connections than he would have been, you know, kind of thumping the Bible. He did try to push Darwin into becoming a clergyman. So that's why Darwin was originally going to train to be a doctor. He goes to the University of Edinburgh and he washes out there for various reasons. He goes to Cambridge with the idea that he's going to become a clergyman because it's socially respectable. It's the type of thing if you want to potter around with your and collect your beetles, well, a clergyman is a pretty good, you know, give your sermons on Sunday and go out on Monday and do your collecting, right? So that, you know, so Darwin never obviously had a deep calling for religion, but he never at the same time never had like this moment where he says, okay, well, certainly by the time at the end of the Beagle voyage, he had sort of moved away from that for various reasons. Now, his father didn't want him to go on the Beagle, mostly because he was worried about his son becoming essentially a boozy loser. I mean, that may be, he was worried that Darwin would drift and would never do anything with his life, and spending time kind of monkeying around on this Admiralty voyage didn't seem to be a particularly good use of his time when he could be doing other things more productive. Darwin went to his uncle then went to his father, talked his father into it, and his father not only allowed him to go, but crucially sort of bankrolled. So, you know, Darwin, I mean, nobody hired him to do this. He went entirely on his father's money. Probably the more interesting thing, I think, if you want to see a relationship between kind of religious faith and his ideas, would be between Darwin and his very devout wife, Emma. But they managed to make accommodations.
Question is directed to Will Wissom. I'm wondering if there are any creationist accounts in the Quran.
Yes, the Quran is very similar to the Bible in that sense. The stories are similar and parallel. So there are creationist accounts in the Quran, and there are also scholars who claim that they can find evolution in the Quran. We actually, in the last conference, Muslimish conference we had here in October, titled Islam and Science, Can They Coexist? We had one speaker who had a total theory of evolution from an Islamic perspective. How effective is that, or how accurate? That's, you know, open for opinion. But yes, it is definitely a creationist account.
Where is Darwin in that picture?
I believe this is the casket. He's dead. Yeah, this is his funeral. He's buried in Westminster Abbey. Oh yeah. So this was, I mean, and this is about one of the highest honors you can get, of course, if you're English, is to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Within a few feet. Actually, he's buried right next to John Herschel, who I mentioned. He's buried adjacent to Isaac Newton. So this is, and I would actually say one thing, you know, about kind of creationism and biblical literalism. Now, there were biblical literalist attacks on Darwin during his lifetime, but for the most part, biblical literalism in Britain was a spent show. You know, they tried to attack geology and it didn't work. And so very few of the most important critics of Darwin would have attacked him on biblical literalist grounds. There had been other religious grounds to do it. Like Bishop Wilberforce was not a biblical literalist. He would not and did not attack Darwin on these grounds.
Was he still alive when the survival of the fittest kind of theory was going around in business to justify why the white race or those were higher than what was perceived as the lower races, and it was a perversion of Darwin, but was he still alive and did he have a reaction to that?
Yeah, he had a reaction to it. I mean, one of his letters, he kind of noted rather ruefully that people are using his theory to justify the bad business practices of dishonest Manchester businessmen. So he was aware of that. On the other hand, he, when you talk about the issues as kind of race, if Darwin's views on race are abhorrent. I mean, so you might like to think that these are that the idea that there are hierarchies of races and the whites are on top, and you think that's a distortion of Darwinism? Well, I would certainly say it's unscientific, but it's an unscientific view that Darwin himself subscribed to. Similarly, in The Descent of Man, his explanation of what we could call sexual dimorphism in humans, difference between men and women, not, you know, from a modern scientific point of view or a modern social point of view, again, these are incredibly sort of retrograde sort of ideas. And so Darwin, I mean, I deeply admire Darwin, but Darwin was a man of his time, and like a man of his time, he had a lot of views that were pernicious.